Welcome back to Legislative Lens, People and Policy. I'm your host, State Rep Michelle Badger, and today I'm excited to bring you the second episode in our Spotlight series on the committees I serve on and the way their work impacts Plymouth. In this series, I sit down with committee chairs, and in this case, vice chair as well, to learn more about their mission and priorities, then connect that work back to the real issues facing our community. This month, our focus is on the Joint Committee on Housing, a committee tackling one of the most pressing challenges in the Commonwealth, ensuring residents have access to safe, affordable, and sustainable housing. In part one, I'm joined by Committee Chair Richard Haggerty and Vice Chair Representative Andrianne Ramos. Together, we'll talk about the committee's mission, its key objectives this season, and the work being done to address housing across Massachusetts. Chair Haggerty is a state rep for the 30th Middlesex, which consists of parts of the town of Reading and Woburn. He's a graduate of the University of New Hampshire and was first elected as state representative in 2019. Now in his fourth term, he is the chair of housing. Vice Chair Andrianne Ramos serves the 14th Essex, which consists of parts of the town of Amesbury, Boxford, Groveland, North Andover, and the town of West Newbury. She's a graduate of the University of Maine and New England School of Law, and she was first elected in 2022. Then in part two, we'll bring the conversation closer to home here in Plymouth, where I'll be joined by Plymouth's town planner, Lee Hartmann, and Matt Sheridan, owner and president of Sheridan Home Builders. They'll share their perspective on local housing challenges and opportunities and what these issues mean for families and businesses and our community's future. As always, my goal with these conversations is to give residents of the First Plymouth District a clear picture of how the work happening at the State House connects directly to daily lives here at home. So let's get started. Part one is with my conversation with Chair Richard Haggerty and Vice Chair Andrianne Ramos. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So we'll start. So in an earlier episode, we did a deep dive on how committees work and the function behind them with Chair Garberly and State Rep Mark Sylvia. It's a great kind of starting place to understand how committees work. But for our listeners who aren't familiar with the workings of committees, can you start by explaining the mission of the Joint Committee on Housing?
Sure. Happy to kind of give a snapshot overview. So there are 11 members of the House that serve on the Joint Committee on Housing, 6 members of the Senate. There is two chairs, a Senate chair and a House chair. And of course, I'm fortunate to serve as the House chair. And we deal with everything related to all things housing, from condo laws to 40B to our shelter system to zoning matters to our public housing stock. You name it, production, all things housing fall under kind of our umbrella. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the committee plays an incredibly important role in vetting legislation that has been put forward through either legislators or, as you know, in Massachusetts, citizens can also file legislation. And we go through all those pieces of legislation, and they're given a public hearing and an opportunity to be heard, an opportunity for folks to testify. And then the committee works together to figure out what things are good ideas, what things maybe aren't good ideas, and figure out what the next steps might be.
Thank you. Now, you've already kind of addressed some of the biggest pressing issues that we've kind of we have with housing and why this is so critical. So how does the work of the Housing Committee kind of connect to the broader goals? You know, we hear about affordability and equity and community development throughout. We've had hearings where we've talked about, housing issues with seniors, and we've talked about zoning, and we've talked about all kinds of issues. But I know underneath everything that we kind of discuss and that I think we see throughout at the House is about making sure things are affordable, equitable, and that are developing our community in the ways that need to kind of happen moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and the truth is, when I talk about housing, as I go around the state and with our colleagues, I kind of start from that standpoint around equity. I mean, at the end of the day, what is more important to have an equitable society than to have everybody be able to have a roof over their head? And that is a critical component to how people live, and all the other challenges that might come with somebody who ends up in a homelessness situation. So, I think that's where I kind of start, and then I kind of pivot from there and talk about economic development. And there are times when we're 351 cities and towns, and there are times when we are one Commonwealth. And when it comes to economic growth and success, that is directly related to whether or not people can afford to live in our state, whether or not people can afford to, buy a home, rent an apartment, have access to housing. All of those things are things that companies look at when they're making decisions about where to set up shop, where to grow, where to expand their business. And for me, I think that housing, the reason why it's so critical is obviously because of the fact that people need it to be able to live. But beyond that, our long-term economic success is directly tied to it.
Oh, completely. If we don't have housing, we don't have anything, right? I mean, you can't keep an economy running if we don't have places for everybody to live and everyone to thrive, right? And I know.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And I think we've seen that theme sort of throughout all of the bills and the hearings that we've had so far, and even just talking to community members and sitting on other committees. I mean, it's amazing how much comes back to the issue of housing and in increasing housing and having housing available for everyone, regardless of your physical disabilities or your income levels or your age. It always comes back to housing.
Yes, it totally does. And I mean, last session was when the Affordable Homes Act was passed, and there's some really incredible pieces to that piece of legislation. I don't know if one of you wants to kind of talk about some of the highlights that were part of that, because I feel as though, and I've heard you all say in our committee hearings that you did the Affordable Homes Act, and then we've got this year, as you've mentioned, we're kind of looking at how does that work? How do we get to that place where we have more housing available for people? How do we get the systems to be working in place to get to that 220,000 homes that we're short of?
Yeah, it was the largest housing bond bill that the legislature has ever passed at over $5 billion. And it touches on just about everything within the housing world. A big chunk of it goes towards our public housing supply, to update our public housing supply to make sure that those are livable and that they are properly maintained for folks who call our public housing supply home. And we wanted to make sure that was that was a big piece of the overall bill. One of the other things on the public housing side that it did was it created a situation where we were able to have some of our public housing supply be less vacant, so turnover quicker in the event that somebody were to leave and a unit became available. Some of these dollars are going towards turning over those units as rapidly as we can. From a policy perspective, there was upwards of 30 pieces of public policy in that bill. The most obvious, I think, that people probably have heard about is our accessory dwelling unit by right component that allowed ADUs across the state by right. And we're seeing those kind of roll out now. And I think that the success of that piece of policy is going to be really apparent in the coming years. It's going to benefit, I think, seniors who may want to build ADU on one of their kids' lots. It might help somebody in their 20s who is maybe doesn't want to leave the family homestead yet, but is able to maybe live in an ADU on the property and then save a few bucks to be able to eventually purchase a home or a condo. It helps folks, maybe in the developmental disability community, right? Making them live independently, but on the same lot as maybe a family member. So ADUs, and then, from an investment standpoint of view, also one of the caveats we put in there was that people can rent these. So somebody can build an ADU and then rent it out in order to generate some income. So those are kind of some of the big policy topics we touched on. I don't know if there's any others the vice chair wants to reference.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we look at this large bill, it really was trying to get at all of these different areas where there's touch points that we can improve upon, and recognizing that housing isn't done in a vacuum. So, I mean, even like funding for MWRA, right? So I represent a town, a community that's well only, and they have said, well, we would love to support more housing, but how?
Yep.
Because we don't have that infrastructure. So we're looking at, that, and keeping that vulnerable population housed. I think as we had the debate around the shelter system last year and in the last couple of years, and what that looks like, and who was in the shelter system, one of the things that I think came out of it in a positive way is what is dignified housing, and how do we keep these vulnerable populations housed in a way that doesn't break the budget, quite frankly, and looking at how we do that with sort of wraparound services, and community-based services in conjunction with housing. So I think that was a great component of this bill that I'm excited to see start to be implemented.
One of the other things I just wanted to touch base on was the Momentum Fund, which I think has had real success. And I give the Housing Livable Community Secretary at Augustus a lot of credit for standing up that program and directing resources towards middle income developments. We know that there's a substantial need there to make sure that teachers and firefighters and cops and folks who are kind of in that middle income area are able to potentially purchase a home. So this helps developers kind of make the math work when they're doing some of these types of middle income housing developments.
Thank you for all that. Thank you for that. No, thank you for that great overview. And I think one thing that you kind of brought into my head while you were talking, is as you're kind of planning out the way that the committee kind of addresses and learns about issues and have informational hearings. One of the other things we do is we have the site visits. Like we had the opportunity to go to St. Francis House and Pine Street Inn and kind of get an understanding of how those wraparound services we're talking about are possible and what we're able to do. I don't know if between the two of you want to share like how you plan those site visits or plan out whether or not we have those informational. I think we had 2 informational hearings, and then we have our hearings that are on different topic areas with bills, how that kind of all works within the housing committee?
Sure. I can take that a little bit. I want to make sure that the committee has access to understanding the different types of housing stocks that are out there. And, we're going to hopefully do some more public housing tours. But specifically, we did St. Francis House and Pine Street Inn in order to understand kind of our homelessness population and what types of wraparound services are really working to make sure these folks remain housed. And we know that, there's a substantial need, but getting in there, as you both have, and seeing it firsthand, the incredible work folks are doing. And again, I say wraparound services because, housing is a big piece of it, but there's also food insecurity issues, issues of, healthcare, on mental health and other challenges that people may be facing. So learning about how we can kind of partner with some of our other committees to potentially pair legislation that addresses all those needs. So that's kind of where we started with regards to some of these tours, because there's nothing better than getting boots on the ground to understand and see it firsthand. I don't know if the vice chair has anything to add to that.
No, I think it is always different when you get to see things with your own 2 eyes and understand what people that are in those communities are going through, and get to talk to the staff and the residents. I mean, there's nothing more valuable than that, and it puts into context the people that we're talking to when we are in these hearings. So, Michelle, we're happy to travel down your neck of the woods. Let us know.
Yeah, of course. We'll see what we can do. We've got some great. The Coalition for the Homeless and some other areas that are really doing some great work, like St. Francis House. And but I found that St. Francis House visit to be really powerful, just to see everything happening in one place, that wraparound services that are so needed, because you often, as you just mentioned, or you both just mentioned, when there's a housing problem, or if there's a food insecurity, or we see it when we get people asking for unemployment, there's usually other reasons. So you're in unemployment, maybe you also need help to find a food pantry. Or if you're unhoused, is there an addiction problem? Is there mental health? Is there a food pantry need? Is there a family? So there's it's so important to do those wraparound services so people can be successful in the long run, and that we're not just setting them up to, all right, here's a place to live, and then maybe they don't stay there, or they don't thrive as they should. So thank you for giving us those opportunities. So my next question would be about like some of the major bills. Like, are there some really interesting bills that you both have seen come through that really have kind of got you thinking this session, or that you think are coming up later that are very interesting to you? I mean, obviously I don't even know how many bills that we've already heard, but there's definitely a substantial number of them. So and some great ideas. So just kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So, there's no shortage of good ideas. And I think the public hearing process really allows people the opportunity to bring it to our attention and help make the case for the different pieces of legislation that they've advocated for and that they're filing. So I think that public hearing piece has been really important and successful. We've got about 200 bills in front of the committee right now. We have 2 more hearings lined up. We have one next week and then one in November. Some of the ideas that we continue to talk through and that have been filed in some cases for years, in some cases new files. Things like tenant right to purchase that the House actually put in the Affordable Homes Act when we passed that originally. Didn't make the final cut last time around, but TOPA is certainly something that has I think continues to make a real case and makes a lot of sense, and something that's really, as a policy, developed over time to make sure that we're protecting and not adversely impacting, small property owners, which, we're very mindful of. So that's one example. I think home sharing, there's a terrific bill on home sharing that Representative Cahill has filed. There's a great site plan review bill that was filed by Rep. Kasner that we continue to look at. The junk fees that some of our larger housing developments are charging some of our renters. We're gonna take a real close look at that. The Attorney General's office earlier this fall made some determinations on some of the junk fees. So hopefully we can take a look at that and make sure that our renters are not being squeezed and that they're not being charged unfairly. So those are some of the ideas. I guess parking regulations is something that kind of hits home to people. If you've done some housing development in your community, you know that you get to 100 units and it's next to a transit center, and a local zoning ordinance might require a space and a half. Meanwhile, half the garage is empty because a lot of the folks either have one vehicle or none. So those are the kind of ideas that we're talking about and thinking through. But the good news is there's no shortage of ideas, and we got to keep digging in.
Yeah, it's true. I do think too, it's interesting to kind of look at the bills that are coming through around seasonal communities and sort of how we provide, ensure that we've got housing for employees who are coming to the state for seasonal work and housing them again so that they're not living in their cars because we want to keep those economic areas, profitable, and we want to keep people coming back to the state and bring in those tourist dollars. But in order to do so, we really have to have a place for them to live. So I think there's some creative ideas around that. I think we've heard some, and I think we have some coming up in the next hearing. So again, as Mr. Chairman says, there is not a lack of ideas for sure, but sort of how we move forward, and looking at that sort of push and pull between different parts of the state and different types of communities, whether it's a rural community or an urban community or a suburban community. There is a little bit of a push and pull for what works best for each of those types of communities.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance because, like you said, every community needs different things, whether you're fully well water or like what is it that your issues are that you're having, that you need housing, but how do you get it? And it's going to look different on the Cape than it looks in Western Mass and it looks in the North Shore. And the Seasonal Communities Act, those issues around housing in those communities, like Plymouth is one of them that, or hopefully will be one of them that we struggle with making sure that people can afford to live here. We have places that you can get great, and off-season rental is great. Get yourself a winter rental, but what do you do then? What do you do in the spring at the end of the spring when people start to come back to their summer homes? Or what do you do when they're looking to rent it out to an Airbnb? So there's so many different issues to take in. It's been really interesting to be on the committee as someone who doesn't come from a particularly deep housing background, just knowing that I have a community that deeply needs housing, and we deeply need to figure out the variety of housing. I think we hear that a lot. I think the last hearing we had, it was a lot about where do we put this housing and how do we make sure we have different housing for different people? Like, yes, in God's backyard, that one comes right off the top of my head where you're talking about how do we make sure that people who have land and want to develop it have an opportunity to develop it in a way that's going to help our communities, So,
yeah. And, it's funny, when I was in law school, I heard the term NIMBY for the first time, and I was like, what is a NIMBY? And then read many cases where NIMBYs became a problem. And so it's interesting to see it be more of a wide known, sort of accepted term. And I think that is certainly something that we face in many communities, and some are, NIMBYs for good reason.
Yep.
And some are not. And I do like that we've got this yes in my backyard and yes in God's yard.
Yep.
I like that we're flipping things around. But I do think we need to take a look at, finding that balance and pushing through. I think, a lot of the opposition to some of those things come from people who were able to purchase homes because things were just more affordable. It was just saying, the pricing in housing, across the country, but particularly here in Massachusetts, it's just not, what it was 30, 40 years ago.
It's harder to attain. I mean, you can have two people I was just having this conversation the other night with somebody that they were like, I don't understand why I can't afford a house. My husband and I both make a decent living, but still we can't. It gets further and further away from us. So I think as we work through these things, it's just been the ideas have been really interesting that people have shared. And I think that goes back to another point that was made earlier, that some of these bills are heard over and over because they're refined as we go through. Because it's not that they're a bad idea. I mean, I'm sure there are bad ideas out there, but for the most part, a lot of the bills that have been filed are filed over and over because they're a good idea, but we need to get to the point to where it's going to work for the Commonwealth. Because it's not just, as you said, sometimes it's one Commonwealth and sometimes it's 351 different communities with different needs. So how does a piece of legislation impact and help everybody? And
right.
So that seems...
I think TOPA is a good example of that, Rep, because TOPA was a bill that's been filed several sessions and really been talked about even much longer than that. But over time, it's found a way to bring together, small property owners, organizations, to allow them the opportunity to be able to advocate to make sure that we're not, adversely impacting, the 80-year-old widow who relies upon the rent downstairs, who's selling her home to go maybe move in with a child, with one of their kids. So carving somebody like that out, a certain number of units that would actually trigger a tenant's first right of refusal. So that type of stuff takes time, and good policy takes time sometimes.
Yeah, I know it's hard for people to hear that, but it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I think too, as someone who's worked in the law and had to apply the law, once we pass a bill, then it becomes a law. It's really hard to undo. And I think sometimes when people get frustrated with the legislative process, they forget that. They don't remember, or they don't know that it's hard to change. So we try to get it right, to the extent that we can. And that takes time. It takes input from stakeholders and input from, people who are going to be in the field and working and understand it. So it can be frustrating, but it's for the best, I think.
No. We look across the state. We look across the country for a lot of this stuff as well, I would say.
Yep.
Seasonal communities is a classic example, right? It came out of Vail, Colorado, largely, where there's been a very successful seasonal communities initiative out there. We've got over 2 decades of data supporting the efforts of the folks who push seasonal communities to make sure that we're creating middle income housing. And there's other examples, right? A single stair, an example of, in Commonwealth today, you need 2 sets of stairs if you're building above 3 stories. And, from an egress standpoint of view, from a safety standpoint of view, for a long time, that made a heck of a lot of sense. But, in New York, you've been able to do a single stair since the 1970s. In Portland, it's been more than 20 years. So there's other parts of the country that are doing some of these types of things that we can pull lessons from and hopefully apply best practices to the legislation that we're going to adopt.
I think that's important for people to hear, just that it's not anything we want to do quickly. It's all about making sure it's the right way for Massachusetts, not just something that's a good idea and let's see what happens. So I know you guys are really busy, so I just wanted to see, is there any other kind of takeaways you wanted to leave with our listeners about the housing committee and kind of how it functions or what we're up to?
No, I mean, I appreciate you having us on today and giving us a chance to chat a little bit with you. And, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank
you.
Yeah,
Rep, thanks for having us on. We, I really appreciate it. I've got the best vice chair in the business, by the way, and Rep Ramos. So we're appreciative of her efforts and her work, yes. And we're excited to continue to dig in. And I would just let your listeners know that we want to hear from folks. Their participation in the process of government matters, and testimony matters. So if they care about something, or sometimes if they don't like something,
exactly,
it's important to let committees know and go through that process. The legislative website we have is terrific, I think, and certainly if people want to weigh in, they can always reach out to their local rep in order to figure out how best to do that. And thank you again for having me on and for your continued good work for your district.
No, thank you so much. It's funny, every single episode we have, whether I bring it up or someone else does, it's that when I'm trying to get that theme out there, that it's about engaging. If we don't hear from you, we don't know. We don't know if you like it. We don't know if you think it's the worst idea under the sun. So it's important that people are engaging, that we're, written testimony. There's so many options now. You can do virtual, you can do in person, or just that written, which is just as impactful. So I just thank you both so much. Thank you, Chair Haggerty and Vice Chair Ramos, for sharing these insights into the missions and the priorities of the Housing Committee this session, and for taking the time to be with us today. I know how busy you are. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you and to serve on this committee. I've learned so much in, I don't know, what has it been, 6 months or so? It's clear that the work happening at the State House has a direct impact on our communities across Massachusetts. And so in the next half of our episode, we'll be talking about how the Housing Committee and the work that's done on the state level impacts what's happening in our local community. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks so much.
In the second half of today's episode, I want to bring that conversation closer to home. Joining me are Plymouth's own Director of Planning and Development, Lee Hartmann, who has served the town of Plymouth in a variety of roles for over 36 years, and Matt Sheridan, owner and president of Sheridan Home Builders, Sheridan Inc., and Sheridan Properties, and a proud 2000 graduate of Plymouth South High School. This is our opportunity to talk about housing challenge and opportunities we're seeing locally, and how statewide policy connects to the day-to-day experiences of families and businesses here in Plymouth. So welcome to the podcast, Matt and Lee. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
I'm so glad. We're excited to finish up this part of the conversation, bring it closer to home. So we're going to start with Lee and talk a little bit about the history of Plymouth from the development and planning perspective for someone who has deep roots, having lived here and worked here in the area for decades, and has seen the community kind of change.
Sure. So the big changes for Plymouth came when Route 3 was built, and then we also had the nuclear power plant that was constructed. So we had very, very low taxes, and we had great access either to Cape Cod, New Bedford, Providence, and Boston. So from the 60s and 80s, we saw quite a bit of growth in the community. Basically between 1960 and 1980, West Plymouth appeared. Prior to 1966, 67, there was really not a West Plymouth. And then you had a very large suburban area. And since then, we've seen a lot of growth in the community. And what we hear time and time again, the beauty of the town, its location, the Cape Cod Bay, the ponds and lakes it has, as well as the downtown, a very vibrant downtown. And I'm struck by how many people who move to this community who just say how they absolutely just love it. So I think we have a lot of available land, we have close proximity, and it is just a very desirable place for people to want to live.
It really is. And I mean, not just West Plymouth, talk about where I grew up and where I live is South Plymouth, and there was no South Plymouth. I remember in college, I met Brooks Barnes, who went to my undergrad. And when I met her for the first time, she was like, where you live was just forests. Like nobody lived there, So we've really done quite a change in a very short period of time.
And some of that's good and positive, but
yes.
Some of it has negative effects too. And we do hear from other people who feel like, they would rather see a little less growth occurring. And certainly I understand that.
Yes, there's definitely like a balance, right? We've got to figure out because we have the beauty of our environment, but there's also people want to live here and it's a great place. And it kind of is a great transition over to Matt, who's been a builder here for over 20 years, grew up here like I did. And so has seen Plymouth change and probably gets a lot of that conversation of like, where do we go with Plymouth? How do we make sure people can stay here? So you want to tell me what you've seen over the last 20 years?
For sure. So I definitely can't talk about seeing Route 3 being built because that was before I was even born.
It was before
you were born too.
It was before my time too.
But I mean, I know personally in the last 20 years, having been born and raised here, I think you see subdivisions like the Pine Hills all of a sudden come in, Red Brook. I think there have been a couple of really monster projects that have kind of changed everybody's mentality in the town about building and development and what it should look like. And I think even more so probably, and I think Lee would probably agree, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real almost stigma attached to building and development. And it's become, instead of how beneficial it can be for our community, it's almost become very adversarial and in some cases very contentious. So I think from 2000 to where we are now, I think that's kind of how the dynamic has shifted in the town with how people actually view a lot of building and development just through other things that are happening like 40B and other things the town can't really control, but it's directly impacting folks at a local level and definitely changing the overall mentality of our entire community.
Oh, yeah.
And we see that. So I like to point out that over the last 5 or 6 years, outside of Cambridge and Boston, no other community has had more housing constructed than Plymouth.
Yes.
And that comes at a strain. And the fire department, the fire chief, police chief will both tell you that the need to provide services, and as some of these higher density 40Bs where you have a high concentration of people, the number of trips and services they have to provide to those facilities is starting to really strain. So we do see that also with growth that, again, is pretty much unparalleled when you look at the rest of the Commonwealth.
Yeah. So we've got the growth. What is in like some other bigger housing challenges? You've kind of hit on some of that, but we're facing right here in Plymouth.
Well, I think it depends how you look at that question, whether, I think, the staple thing everybody goes to is affordability. How do you actually create affordable housing in Plymouth? And Lee can certainly talk about this at great length. Our criteria is based off of Cambridge incomes for affordable housing. And it's a huge problem. And it's not actually truly affordable. There's another whole demographic of people that slip through the cracks that don't actually qualify for affordable housing, even as unaffordable as it is.
Yeah.
And they can't do anything, and I kind of categorize those people as workforce housing. Yeah. It's the school teachers, the nurses, the people that work at BID, they first responders like Plymouth Police. I believe they're required to live in Plymouth, and a lot of them can't actually. It's a struggle for them to actually afford to live in the town, and they don't actually qualify for any kinds of subsidies. So that to me is a huge problem with facing the town, with how you can actually keep people that want to work and engage in the town.
And I think the other thing and I agree completely, is that we have veterans and seniors in the community too. And sometimes we don't hear as much, but I think the need to provide affordable housing for veterans and seniors is also important. And I know Matt has been involved in both of those too, in trying to provide housing that is something that may be more affordable than what you see out there. I also like to point out, when I talk about affordable housing, there's a capital A affordable housing, which I refer to as the state's mandate to provide affordable housing. But then the lowercase affordable housing, which is our commitment and our obligation to provide housing for our seniors, for our family, and for our children. And so, as Matt pointed out, sometimes the state law really doesn't provide truly affordable housing. And I would say when you look at the state, which says that you provide affordable housing at 80% of the median household income for the Boston, Cambridge area, that's not truly affordable when we talk about rentals.
Yep.
When you do look about home ownership, it does become a little more affordable. A 2-bedroom affordable house is in the $310,000 range for a 2-bedroom house. So if it's home ownership, it's a little more affordable, but the rental numbers really don't make sense for affordability in Plymouth. And the bulk of what we see for new 40B development is rental.
Where do you find that $310,000 2-bedroom home?
Well, Lee is spot on with this.
Yeah.
It's, I think that's another big problem is, you see more rentals going out onto the market that are affordable housing, but even at that 80% AMI, they're still not actually quote unquote affordable. That's why I've been trying to target, I've permitted a few projects that have been at 60% AMI or 70%. I just did one this week, those at 70% AMI. And because those bring the numbers down drastically for people to actually be able to try to afford it. And then it's like Lee said, the sales price, it does become very affordable. But the problem is actually being able to construct it and build it and make it viable, which is another challenge in itself. So for me personally, one of my next projects, I have 4 affordables in it, and I'm already looking at those, figuring out the numbers, making sure that everything's going to work, because that can present some challenges when you start looking at all your construction costs and everything else. I'm very fortunate I'm going to be able to make it all work, but I know a lot of builders and developers try to steer clear of it altogether, just because for some of them it can be a huge hurdle to clear.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing I find is, with the best of intentions, we have the DEP, who talks about stronger and stronger regulations, rightfully, for protection of our groundwater for our septic systems.
Yep.
We have the building code, which is constantly evolving for more energy efficiency. And those sometimes compete with the need to try to, how do you construct an affordable house, providing all these extra things, very worthwhile, but they add to the cost, which then makes it even harder for someone like Matt to then comply with all these new regulations. Again, really important regulations, but then how do you truly then have a house that's affordable once you have to do that?
Yeah.
I think, and with that, I think part of the problem is a lot of these things that are happening now with different code changes and mandates really through the state with what you're required to do as a builder or developer. I think they're all very well-intentioned, but they're not actually seeing the long-term consequences or effect of a lot of it right now. With quote unquote being, almost forced into having to build greenhouses, that, make less of a footprint. It's an amazing concept. It's just a lot of the ways it's being done and handled, they're not actually thinking about real world consequences with, oh, wow, this is going to add 15 to 20% to construction costs. And it's like, how do you actually do it? So I think it's one of those things where great intentions, but it almost should be more slow rolled instead of just kind of put out there and said, this is the new criteria for what you actually have to do.
We were just talking about that in the first part of this podcast with the chair and vice chair of the housing committee about how, sometimes changes are needed and changes happen, and it's really cumbersome and people don't understand why it takes so long to make a change, but it is the intention of the lawmakers or people up in Beacon Hill, over the last, many years as they've been trying to make these changes, that we are trying to make the legislation as good as it can be. And we talked about the importance of having voices of everybody involved in part of the conversation because of the fact that my background's in education, higher ed and K-12, but I don't know. I'm in the housing committee and I'm learning as I go and learning from people like both of you on how things impact them. And so that we were talking through the first part about really how it can take a long time to make those changes. Like you're saying, like we might need some changes on how you roll out certain criteria, building criteria, but it might take a longer amount of time to get those changes made on the state level because it goes through committee, and then sometimes goes to study, and then it has to be filed again. And so some things that are really well intentioned take a really long time to make those changes that would benefit you all. But locally, things can happen, faster and quicker. But sometimes, obviously, locally, your hands are tied by what happens at the state level. But we're talking about the kind of where we're going and how we're moving forward. And I know the town's been involved in several planning processes, long-term planning on addressing, the balance between affordable housing, open space, and community growth. I don't know if we want to share some about that with us.
Sure. So I think right now a lot more of the focus locally is how do you provide truly affordable? So, well, for the most part, everybody looks at that capital A affordable 80% AMI, and more in the town, the town is looking at how do we provide something that's more like 60 or 50% of the average income so that you have something that's truly affordable. So I think as we move forward, the question is, and again, everybody wants to control what the community can say or not say. So trying to meet the state's requirement for 10% affordable, but also then looking at what can we do to create truly affordable housing also in Plymouth. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger focuses. Yeah. And I also want to point out that when we talk about the local level, we have a local bylaw that says every new development that Matt builds, 10% of the units have to be affordable.
Yep.
When we worked on that bylaw, I always envisioned that was a community process. It's not Matt's responsibility to provide affordable housing.
No.
It's something we as a community need to do. I was very amazed that when that bylaw was passed, all of a sudden everybody looked and said, well, you're required to do 10%.
Hey, builder, figured out.
Yeah, that's your responsibility. And I always envisioned it as a team process between the Affordable Housing Trust, the CPC, the planning board, planning department, and the developer to say, how do we do this collectively? Yeah. And I think we're starting to get there now. Yeah. But for the first probably 15 years of that bylaw, a lot of it was just, well, that's your problem. You're required to do it. You figure it out. And again, I think my main thing that I want to stress is that it's a community issue that we all need to work on.
Oh, yeah. And doing it in a way that it's kind of done in a holistic manner where it's you have your 4 units and they're not all like, oh, the affordable units are right here. Find these people. I feel like so many times when you look at affordable housing or a complex that's forced to do that, they're all in one place. So it's like, oh, this is where the affordable housing people live. And so integrating them into the community is always a good way of, or not the community because they're integrated anyways, but integrating them to their development or their complex where they live is so important that we're not poking fingers and be like, these people can't afford it, but these people can.
And I think it's important to note because some of the wording you just used.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Some of the wording you just used, and oftentimes I still hear, not as much as I used to, oh, this is low-income housing.
Yeah.
We're talking about families, working families, and when we talk about affordable, believe it or not, and it blows my mind, a family of 3 or 4, affordable housing is an income of over $100,000 for that family. So this is not low-income housing. It's more affordable.
Yes. So it's more affordable, and I think that's really important. And that's what we consider the AMI or what. And as you said, it's based off of Boston and Cambridge, which doesn't work here.
I think it's, again, with what both of you are saying, I think it's just there's a stigma attached to it. Yes. And I mean, quite frankly, some of the projects I'm building, again, like the one I just permitted this week, those rentals are going to be based off of 70% AMI. Those are market units, and they're going to be available to the entire public. Yeah. And those buildings are actually probably going to be, with the medical facility I'm doing, they're going to be 2 of the nicest buildings on Oberry Street. Yeah. So,
not that there aren't very nice buildings.
There are very
buildings
nice
on Oberry Street, and I might be a little biased when I say that. But I think there's a stigma attached to it, and people don't actually realize that that's not what everybody's intending with, affordable housing. It's, and I think that's overall as a community, we need to work to get away from that kind of mentality.
Yep. What does it mean, and how do we help everybody live here? And that like mixed use, I think, is such a brilliant way to integrate like an entire community together. That we've got. I like Red Brook or Pine Hills and places like that you've got a community center, you've got what you need in this space, but you're still part of the town of Plymouth. Now, I know obviously with rising costs, with labor and things like that, how is that impacting your ability to be able to provide these units?
It's difficult, and you kind of, I personally, I walk a very fine line with, okay, this makes sense from a business standpoint, and it's going to benefit our community. And absolutely rising construction costs, rising labor costs make it very difficult. But there are a lot of, I call them hidden costs that people don't actually realize. So if you try to sell an affordable unit right now, it actually ends up costing almost 6%.
Really?
So you're talking about, I can sell a market unit and maybe a realtor might only end up getting 2.5% or 5% or whatever that particular deal is. To sell an affordable unit, it costs easily 6%. So
Interesting.
and that's just through all the mechanisms you have to use to advertise it, to get it out there, the agencies you have to involve. So we talk about we need affordable housing, and it's almost like, well, every step you take, there's another hurdle in front of you, you know? So my office, my team and I, we've actually looked at, okay, can we remove some of these other folks and keep it internal to keep our costs down? And at the end of the day, Lee knows all the hurdles you have to go. At the end of the day, we can't. And, you know, compared to some smaller companies, we're set up to try to do it. And it becomes almost too much work and too daunting to not bring in one of those agencies. So it's really the hidden fees on top of everything else you hear make it extremely difficult.
Can you walk us through that process? Like, so from start, when you're like, I'm going to do an affordable unit, how do I do that?
I go and see Lee. I go and beg Lee to
Help me.
And I think
Help me.
the first part, and I'll let him talk a little more about what he has to go through to actually create the affordable. But I think the first part is when you go through a permitting process. And in Plymouth, it's it's almost every case a special permit.
Yep.
So you have to get that special permit. And you have to go through the planning board. You have peer reviews. You have review by different departments. So that's a very time-consuming and sometimes costly event. The other thing that I see at the first phase is more and more people are using that process as a way to litigate projects and using that process to then tie developments up in court.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to hold somebody in court for 5, 6, 7, 8 years through that court
And then
process.
they just give up.
So the first hurdle Matt has to say is, what's my risk?
Mm-hmm.
What's the cost? So just find out whether I get to yes. And what's the risk associated with getting to that yes?
Yep.
And then after you get to yes, the affordable.
Right. So we go through the entire permitting process and actually hopefully get the project approved, which we don't even have to get into just how daunting that can be in itself. I mean, it can take from just an idea to actually having a permit. Sometimes it can take 18 months, 24 months, and that's honestly if everything goes smoothly.
That sounds like a fast track.
I've had conversations with Lee about projects 2 years ago that I'm literally just trying to like get out the door now, you know? So once you get through all those steps, then it becomes, okay, so what I do is we'll reach out to Peggy Whalen in Lee's office, who's phenomenal. Mm-hmm. She's amazing at her job. And we'll identify, okay, these are what we're going to do for inclusionary or affordable units. And we'll work together on drafting all the documentation. And then from there, once we actually start construction.
So if I could just interrupt quickly, the state has a very rigid set of requirements for what you have to have in place for restrictions, regulatory agreements, things that run with the land in perpetuity. So what Matt's referring to is a very specific set of documents that have to be approved by the town and also obviously approved by the developer. And it takes time and money to actually do those legal documents.
Yeah, no, he's 100% right. Every pretty much authority in the town ends up seeing the select board actually have to vote on them and approve them and sign them. We work with Lee's office on it. So even that in itself, he's totally correct that I was probably downplaying how much actually goes into it. But even that in itself, from the day I call Peggy or somebody in my office reaches out to Peggy, that in itself is probably almost like 6 months worth of work. And
And
then
it's
we
not,
actually
it's not just the local level. So these have
Yes.
to all be approved by the
right.
state too.
Yes.
Yeah,
So-
everything ends up getting shipped up to the state, and then they have to approve it, which honestly, at a local level, we actually get everything out as fast as we can, because then it typically does seem to take way longer to actually get the state to sign off on everything. And then once that's done, then construction starts, and then we can actually start advertising product. And that advertising product in itself, months and months and months. You're talking easily 4 to 6 months from the time that we put a project out there or a unit out there that we're actually like hopefully looking at occupancy just through all the different hurdles it has to go through.
And again, with good intentions, the state has gone to great lengths to try to have a very fair process. So these are lotteries that are happening, and it's not just like somebody or somebody applies. There's a lottery you have to go through, and the requirements to be fair actually cost a lot of money, and it's a lot of time to actually do a lottery that complies with the requirements. And again, I don't want to say that they're unreasonable, but there's a cost associated with trying to reach a large proportion of the community and get the word out, multi-language, locations, different advertising, different places, and that all is time and money.
Yep.
It is. And even with that, a lot through that process actually ends up being, like we'll hear people talk about, we want to try to do some sort of local preference.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When you start attaching those different qualifiers, thanks, Michelle, to that, it actually makes the process last even longer and take even longer, which we want to try to help everybody right here in our community, and then it actually will add months more onto the process. So which is, again, another problem when you're going through all the proper channels, through the state, and when they're actually affordables the town's getting credit for. That's kind of why I'm starting to try to steer towards, like, I want to be doing affordables, but I want to make them open to the general public, which for me, then at that point, it's, it opens up our pool to a whole lot more folks. Yeah. So that's why I'm starting to try to steer in that direction, because there are so many hurdles you have to go through when you're checking off all the boxes through the state.
Yeah. No, I think this is great. Like, this is kind of what this is meant to do. This podcast is kind of break it down. We all know that it's complicated, but people will look at us and say, how do you get, we're 220,000 units shy of where we're supposed to be over the last 10 years, right? And that's what the state is saying. And how do we do it? And why can't we do it tomorrow? This is why we can't do it tomorrow. And it's all done, like you say, with good intentions. It just is making sure a project's done properly. It's making sure that all these, lines are, zoning and all these pieces are met properly. But it's going to take a long time to get those. And not all of the units go through the affordable housing, like the affordable process, but there's still plenty of paperwork that needs to go into, and meetings and things that go into just developing a project for a typical home. I don't know if that's the right wording.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just the work involved in general, just with permitting a standard development is there's a lot of work. The one thing I will say is, I think, though, as a town, I think everybody now is recognizing this is an actual problem, and I think a lot more of our officials are actually getting involved and realizing it's a problem. And I think, not to speak for Lee, but I think he probably wishes a lot of these people have gotten involved a long time ago. And now everybody's starting to kind of recognize this is a real problem, and it's not going to be anything that just the planning department can solve on their own. No. It's going to take getting everybody involved to actually try to do something about this.
So I want to go back to
the planning question.
Your original, yes, way back when. So one of the other things that the master plan has identified, and the things that I think the planning board, and I'll be retiring soon, so the new deputy director, who is now deputy director, Lauren Lynn, will be looking at is for, we use different words, but we'll use what people commonly know, tiny house.
Yes.
And looking at some zoning that may allow for tiny houses that might make something a little more affordable. I also think it's always important to point out that I see this desire, and I agree with it in Plymouth, to try to minimize the impacts of development and try to have lower density, and more open space, which is something I totally agree with. But it comes in direct conflict with providing higher density and more affordable units. So it's always fascinating as we go through a permitting process when you have this immediate reaction, which is how do we minimize impacts, but we want affordable too. Yeah. And it comes at a cost. And sometimes with the higher density, your ability to preserve trees or certain natural features becomes very limited because, again, there's a cost to try to provide that affordable, which is higher density. Yeah. And it's always fascinating as we go through that process to try to figure out where is that balance.
You know, just if I could, with what we're saying, another problem within town is Plymouth is almost in the perfect storm of we have all of this land and all of this area available, but our infrastructure only supports an actual very, very small portion of the town. And by infrastructure, I mean, obviously water, sewer, having major roads available. So Lee's 100% right. It's, development is creeping south, and it is in direct conflict with, okay, we want to provide, as much open space as possible, but then, there's different hurdles through zoning and what you can actually do. And so it's, again, I think Plymouth is almost in the perfect storm of we want to preserve as much as possible, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have everything in place to actually do that. And which is, again, just another problem facing the town.
Yeah. I mean, you just look at the Halfway Pond, Long Pond Road, the construction for the lights there. That's a perfect example of not having the infrastructure we need because there's really no way out. Like you've got to go south to go north if you don't want to wait at that. I mean, it looks beautiful now. I should clear. It's going to be wonderful with the lights. I'm so excited. Live right near it. But like the traffic leading up to it. And so if we're looking to go even further south and you're going to some of these places that have been talked about, there's going to be need of serious road and infrastructure in order for us to make sure that your response time for ambulance or fire or our police is not hindered. And is there need for another fire department? I mean, there's so many, that's a big thing on the town side, but it's a lot because we do need more and that's how we're going to get more. But we need that infrastructure.
And it is, and it's, I find it fascinating. So back in the day, if you wanted a traffic light, you could have a traffic light. And probably, I'll make it up, but 60% of those lights were just traffic lights.
Yeah.
Now, when you do a traffic light, even in a rural area like that, there have to be crosswalks. Yep. There has to be pedestrian access, which is very important.
Yes.
And now for both the town and the state, we talk about complete streets. So you also have to have something available and safe for bicyclists. And again, very important. Mm-hmm. And then you also have safety features so that if emergency vehicles need to go through those lights, that they're able to control those lights so they can respond quickly. All of that comes at an expense, which is a much bigger layout of the road, a much more expensive design, a far more costly infrastructure improvement. So again, that's the other challenge the town is always facing. Yeah. Or if we're looking to a developer to partner with us for some of those improvements, the improvements that we looked at 15, 20 years ago, those same improvements now are exponentially more expensive. And again, rightfully so. But back to my earlier point, there's that comes at a cost type of issue we have to deal with.
And you were telling me when you started working here, we only had 4 traffic lights in all of Plymouth. And we were talking about it, and I was like, wow, it's hard. I mean, we know we've grown. I mean, I feel like I went to college and I came back and I was like, whoa, what happened to Plymouth? Like, this is amazing. And the growth we have is great, but it does come at a infrastructural change that we really need. But what do you both think from like your perspective that the town, that the state can do to maybe like help? Like what are we talking about currently, or what are things that you think the state needs to do?
For me, honestly, and I'm going to be very blunt with this, I looked at a lot of, just knowing we're going to come in and chat, I actually looked at some of the different state policies with what they're rolling out. And I think a lot of them are great on paper, but just in terms of practical real world applications, they're not realistic, So to me, if the state really wants to try to do something about this, I think that they should be looking at how to actually work with communities, and it can't be just this giant blanket that they cast over the entire state. And it should be okay, just because 40B might work in one part of the state doesn't mean it's going to work in another part of the state.
Yep.
So it could be something like 40B. It could be a great tool to have in your toolbox if it was actually used in the correct way to actually try to benefit the community, and create that public-private partnership. So I think on a state level, it needs to be more. There can't just be sweeping reform. It needs to be recognizable that central Massachusetts might have different needs than southern Massachusetts, or western Mass might have way different needs than even, say, Cape Cod, So I think Massachusetts is very unique with, you can drive 2.5 hours west and you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, So I think at a state level, it needs to be more, we need to look at things regionally and not necessarily at a statewide level.
And I agree with that 100%. I always used to say Dalton, Mass, which maybe a lot of people don't know. You have Dalton, Mass, Worcester, Plymouth, and Boston. And to think that you have more or less the same rules for those types of communities, it really needs to be looked at in a more micro level, not at a macro level. And I understand the challenge, 351 communities, and how the Commonwealth can do that. The other thing I would point out, and I'm going to pick a little bit on the MBTA communities law. It's a very difficult thing because this is a mandate that the state has imposed, and I understand why, but they impose it on a town, and there's no carrot. Everything about it is punitive. Yeah. And if you fail to comply, it's legal action. It's revoking of funds. And I keep saying, so Plymouth, as I mentioned earlier, one of the probably more housing being built in Plymouth than any other community outside of Boston and Cambridge. Why can't we have a model with the state to say, Plymouth is the example, and here's what we're going to do for a community that is doing what we're asking for? What are the benefits? What are the, I don't want to say rewards, but again, it's a financial struggle to have this growth. What are we going to do so we could support communities actually doing what we're asking for versus looking at things to say, we're going to penalize you if you don't do certain things. And I think that would be my biggest message.
Instead of just
let's look at those incentives and let's look at what we can do to encourage communities to provide that affordable and provide some benefit versus penalties like the MBTA law seems to do.
Yeah. No, we, in the beginning of the podcast, we were talking with the vice chair and the chair of housing, and they both said, it's the biggest struggle that they face is what you both have said. 351 different communities. Sometimes that's the way you're able to handle them. And then sometimes it's one Massachusetts, we've got one community throughout, but we've got, I think a perfect example is looking at, there's the seasonal communities, like looking at them separately. So how do we then build it and say, all right, how do we look at Plymouth County separately? Is there a way, hopefully we will be qualified as a seasonal community at some point. I think we're pretty close to the qualifications, if I'm not mistaken. I know there were some questions that we were having back and forth about it, but with the Senate chair of housing, I think I was talking with him about it. But yeah, that's the complex piece, is that we need carrots and sticks, and we also need to realize that we are one Massachusetts, but we're also, every single community is so different. And if we are growing, how do you handle us differently versus another community that might not be doing what we're doing to get housing in place?
I always think back my childhood. I grew up in Marlborough, Mass. Moved here in 87, but in Marlborough. And we had a 3-bedroom ranch. There was a family of 7, 5 kids, 1 bathroom. We were on the lower side of income, but it was affordable. And that 3-bedroom was how we started. And how can we think about that model again that I think maybe a lot of us grew up like? And how can we create that 3-bedroom ranch again that's truly affordable? And that's what I always keep coming back to, is that's kind of the model I think we need to try to figure out. How do we do that? And again, Matt can't do a 3-bedroom ranch. He will never he'll lose money on everyone he builds. There's no margin there for him. So how do we then look at that and say, well, what can we do to actually make that model work?
Yeah.
So that just actually, I have 2 different things. I think the first is with what you were just talking about, Michelle, with how you actually look at Plymouth and seasonal communities and, everybody's a little different. I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier with Plymouth's the perfect storm, because you can literally go from North Plymouth, drive for 20 minutes, half hour, and all of a sudden you're on Bourne Road and you're in Plymouth, but you're in a completely different area, landscape, and setting, which that in itself makes for Lee his job really, 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 really hard.
I have people who say, that development on Long Pond Road, and I have to say, well, Long Pond Road is 22 miles long. Where?
And then with what Lee was talking about with how he grew up, obviously, Michelle, you and I, we grew up, we're born and bred in Plymouth. And so with what Lee says, it resonates with me tremendously. And that's why, so I just recently finished permitting a project in South Plymouth. And I was basically saying, I was born in South Plymouth. I know South Plymouth, and it breaks my heart that working families can't actually afford to live in South Plymouth anymore. So I have homes that are going to be starting at $500,000 in a brand new subdivision. And my team, our phone's been ringing off the hook with people wanting to know what's going on and everything else. And to me, it almost makes me very sad that I'm offering something at $500,000, which not
$1 million,
which is a lot of money,
$500,000, and I'm still hundreds of thousands of dollars cheaper than the average sales price in Plymouth. And Lee saw it when I was presenting this project to people. They were falling out of their seats. They couldn't believe when they were looking at the numbers with where Plymouth's at now in terms of affordability, and with what I'm trying to offer the community. It's almost sad that, $500,000 now it's a steal.
It is. It says a lot about where we are.
It says a lot.
It really does. And hopefully with the good work that you're doing, and, if we can, if there's things like we've talked about with the state that you have ideas, like I always say, and I think there's a running theme in this podcast, is advocate, advocate, advocate. If we don't hear from people, we don't know. And I think that's the most important part, because, I'm sure there are builders. Actually, there are builders who are legislators, but we need to hear from everybody, and reaching out to myself, and if anybody from reaching out to Representative Lenatra for the other part of Plymouth, or Senator Fernandez. I think it's really important that we hear from people, because we don't always know. We know housing is a problem, but how do we fix it? How do we get there? And like we were talking about earlier, it's really community. No one person has all the knowledge or the ability to change. We're stronger together. When we come together, we uplift our own community through that. So we've been talking for quite a while. I know you both have busy days, but do you have any last kind of things you want to share that I didn't touch on regarding housing in Plymouth? Or
no, my big one is it's a community issue, and a community that has to do that. That's the builders, the decision makers, the residents, the state. And I think it's a community issue that the community deals with. It's not someone else's responsibility.
Agreed. I agree.
No, I think this is great that you're actually bringing attention to this, and, actually trying to be proactive and get something done. So I think things like this are a great first step in actually making the public aware of what actually needs to happen out there.
Yeah, because we need more kids to be able to grow up in Plymouth and live here or move in here. We're happy with people who move in too, but when you grow up here, you should be able to stay here. It's such a wonderful community. Your family, your friends, everybody's around you. So we really should be able to stay here. And so I think, like you said, community is going to solve this.
How many times I hear people say, I would really like to get my son out of the basement. I would really like to have my house, but he can't afford to move out. And I hear that so often.
Yeah, no, it's hard. It's really hard. But thank you so much for joining this conversation today, helping to connect what's happening with the state with issues right here in Plymouth. And I just wanted to thank you both for joining us today. Thank Chair Haggerty and Vice Chair Ramos, our Director of Planning and Development, Lee Hartmann, who's only a short timer here, but you've done amazing work in Plymouth, and we're so thankful and grateful to have had you here for 36 years.
34 probably.
34, sorry. And then Matt Sheridan, thank you so much for taking your time to really talk with us about someone who's who has hands and feet on the ground dealing with this issue every day. These conversations highlight just the work of the Joint Committee on Housing directly connects to the challenges we face here in Plymouth. From zoning and planning to construction costs and affordability, the issues may look different at the state and local level, but they are deeply connected. My hope is that this discussion has given residents of Plymouth a clear understanding of both the policy work being done on Beacon Hill and the real impacts on families and communities right here at home. In our November episode, we'll be doing a deep dive into the Joint Committee on Higher Education with Chair David Rogers and local higher education leaders. So thank you for listening to Legislative Lens, People and Policy. I'm State Representative Michelle Badger, and I look forward to continuing this series as we highlight the committees I serve on and the issues that matter most to our district. In between episodes, you can stay connected with the work we're doing at the State House by following me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Blue Sky. You can also email me directly at michelle.badger@mahouse.gov with any questions, ideas, or for future episodes, or just anything you want to say and set up a meeting with me. Happy to do it at any time. Thank you again for tuning in to Legislative Lens, People and Policy. Take care and have a wonderful day.